The previous video was an introduction to the Grand Gallery showing the three valves associated with this chamber. Also, Phase 1 of the 4 Grand Gallery phases was described in the previous video. Phase 1 consisted of the electrolysis plates being energized, separating hydrogen and oxygen from the water. These gases collected in the upper portion of the Grand Gallery. After Phase 1 is completed, Phase 2 starts. In Phase 2, the mixture of hydrogen and oxygen is ignited, causing combustion. This combustion causes the pressure to immediately rise in the Grand Gallery. When this happens, the spent gases exit out of the Grand Gallery through the upper check valve. These gases travel into the so-called relieving chambers and dissipate in that area. This is the purpose of the relieving chambers. They provide an area deep inside the Great Pyramid for the gases to go as they travel past the check valve into the upper end of the Grand Gallery. After the gases escape, the check valve closes. As Phase 2 continues, something remarkable happens. A fascinating characteristic of combustion in an enclosed chamber and then removing the excess gases from the chamber through a check valve is that the pressure continues to drop. This is what occurs in the upper area of the Grand Gallery. This unique enclosed chamber and its arrangement of valves with the combustion of hydrogen and oxygen gases creates a powerful vacuum above the water in the upper end of the Grand Gallery. This is the purpose of Phase 2. There are many examples of creating a vacuum using combustion on YouTube, showing a candle burning in an upside-down jar that is placed in water. Using carbon-based fuel, this process moves some water up into the jar, but the effect is much greater when hydrogen and oxygen gases are consumed instead of using carbon-based fuels like a candle or a small piece of paper as fuel. After the electrolysis process, the gases are ignited. The pressure in the Grand Gallery immediately rises. The spent gases escape past the check valve and into the relieving chambers. Then the check valve closes. And a vacuum is created. The use of the chemical reaction of combustion to create a vacuum to produce useful work in a machine is certainly an unusual process in modern times, yet there are wonderful examples that are somewhat similar types of machines that exist in our day and age. One such example is the Humphrey pumping station in Australia. This large pump has an enclosed chamber that uses combustion to create a vacuum. The Humphrey pump does not operate exactly like the Grand Gallery, but it is worth researching this fascinating industrially scaled water pump that has no crankshaft, metal pistons, impellers, or other similar components associated with the internal combustion water pumping systems modern mankind commonly uses. After the combustion in the Grand Gallery, the high-pressure gases were exhausted past the check valve and into the relieving chambers. Let's watch that process before we go to Phase 3. After the gases are ignited, there is high pressure in the Grand Gallery. This high pressure causes the upper check valve to open, and the spent gases move past the open check valve into the relieving chambers. After this occurs, the check valve closes. The pressure in the Grand Gallery continues to drop, and a powerful vacuum is formed in the Grand Gallery. The piston and cylinder is an arrangement of components that is indispensable in our modern age. Pistons and cylinders have more uses than can be counted, and the configurations of cylinders and pistons is seemingly infinite. Automotive engines come to mind, which use pistons and cylinders. The configurations of cylinders and pistons for internal combustion engines are as varied as the people who design them and the unending applications for cylinders and pistons. Everything from steam engines to air compressors use cylinders and pistons. But the use of cylinders and pistons goes way beyond engines. Application of cylinders and pistons are all around us. Hydraulic cylinders, as well as pneumatic cylinders, use the piston-cylinder arrangement. Shock absorbers use pistons and cylinders. A hypodermic syringe is essentially a cylinder and piston. Even guns utilize a piston and cylinder arrangement. The barrel is the cylinder and the bullet is the piston. Pistons move in a cylinder because the pressure exerted on them is greater on one end of the piston than on the other. Pistons move away from the end of the cylinder with the greater pressure and towards the end of the cylinder with less pressure. In a hypodermic syringe, the pressure exerted by the thumb is greater than the pressure exerted on the other end of the piston or plunger. In an automotive engine, the pressure exerted by the combustion of the fuel is greater than the pressure on the other end of the piston. This causes the piston to move away from the higher pressure on one end towards the lower pressure on the other end of the piston. This is also true in guns. When the powder in a round is burned, it creates a higher pressure on one end of the bullet, acting as a piston, than on the other end of the bullet. This causes the bullet to move away from the high pressure towards the lower pressure in the open end of the barrel. The Grand Gallery, even though it is not cylindrical in shape, functions as a cylinder. The piston associated with the Grand Gallery cylinder is the water itself. This massive piston, weighing as much as 300 tons, is the largest liquid piston ever created by mankind. There are two forces acting on this piston. One of the forces is the vacuum above the piston acting to draw the massive water piston up higher in the Grand Gallery. The second force is the water pushing up from underneath the water piston. The water is being pushed up by the subterranean water pump deep below the Great Pyramid. These two forces, acting together, cause the water level in the Grand Gallery to rise higher in this chamber. The additional water needed for this is supplied by the subterranean water pump. These two forces complement each other and cause the water level to move up in the Grand Gallery. The movement of water higher in the Grand Gallery is Phase 3. After Phase 3 is completed, Phase 4 begins. In Phase 4, the check valve in the upper end of the Grand Gallery is opened. This breaks the vacuum. At the same time, the valve leading to the horizontal passage is also opened. How these two valves are opened at the proper time and for the proper duration will be described later. When both of these valves are open, the massive water piston moves down the Grand Gallery. The only place for the water to go is into the horizontal passage leading to the Queen's chamber. This massive piston, almost incomprehensible in size and power, forces water into the horizontal passage and into the Queen's chamber with tremendous power. As soon as the water piston is finished moving down in the Grand Gallery, the two valves that were made to open are returned to the closed position. When this happens, Phase 4 is completed. After Phase 4 is completed, the cycle starts again and Phase 1 begins. There are 4 phases in the Grand Gallery. Phase 1, electrolysis. Phase 2, combustion to create a vacuum. Phase 3, water piston moves up. Phase 4, power stroke. Electrolysis separates hydrogen and oxygen. The gases are ignited and the excess pressure is expelled into the relieving chambers. And then a vacuum is created. The vacuum and lower pump move the water higher in the Grand Gallery. This massive water piston moves down to force water into the horizontal passage. The entire process operates automatically. This machine is so sophisticated, there is no need for workers inside the Great Pyramid water pump. The valves operated like check valves, except for the upper valve and the valve leading to the horizontal passage. These valves opened and closed using a feedback system described later. This feedback system also turned on and off the electrolysis plates. The subterranean water pump pushed up from below on the water piston, and the vacuum in the Grand Gallery helped move the water piston higher. These two forces complemented each other to lift the largest water piston ever created by mankind. The direct physical evidence of waterproof chambers and many other features of the Great Pyramid support the interpretation that the Great Pyramid was built to be a powerful water pumping machine. The original builders were geniuses. The purpose of all of this activity in the Grand Gallery was to move water through the horizontal passage and into the Queen's chamber. How did that help with the water pumping process? What occurred in the Queen's chamber? How did water exit the Great Pyramid water pump? What was the King's chamber for? How was the electrolysis plates powered? How were the valves made to open to allow the water piston to move down the Grand Gallery? These are just some of the many questions that will be addressed as we continue with this video series about the Great Pyramid water pump. I thank you for watching up to this point, and I hope you watch the entire video series. What happens in the Queen's and King's chambers will be the subject of the next video in this series.